May I have your attention, please? Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Mark Hamrick. I'm a broadcast and online journalist with the Associated Press, and I'm the 104th president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming, events such as this, while working to foster a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, we'd invite you to visit our website at www.press.org and to donate to programs offered to the public through our Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library. We'd invite you to look at the website there as well. So on behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you attending today's event. Our head table includes special guests of the speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. And I issue this reminder at all events, those that are political and those that are not. You'll hear some applause in the audience today. We'd like to note that members of the general public are attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. Our luncheons are also featured on our member-produced weekly podcast from the National Press Club, and that's available for free download on iTunes. And you can follow the action on Twitter using the hashtag #NPCLunch. After our guest's speech concludes, we'll have Q&A, and I'll ask as many questions as time permits, and I'll invite you all to send your questions up to the head table here. Now it is time to introduce our head table guests, and I'd note that a journalist's presence at the head table does not necessarily imply or signify an endorsement of the speaker. I'd ask each of you here at the head table to please stand up briefly as your name is announced, and we'll begin from your right. Stephen Ellis is a principal with Saylor Company Public Relations. Ken Melgren is an NPC board member and head of our broadcast committee. Paula Cruikshank is bureau chief and senior White House correspondent with CCH. Bob Carden with Carden Communications, a member of our speakers committee. Mrs. Sharon Rockefeller, president and CEO of WETA here in Washington, and she is a guest of our speaker. Nice to have you here today. Rachel Ray is a U.S. television reviewer for the Daily Telegraph of London and a member of our Speakers Committee. Pat Harrison, President and CEO of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and a guest of our speaker as well. Nice to have you here. Across the podium, and then to Melissa Charbonneau with Newshook Media, Speakers Committee Chair, who helped to organize today's event. And I dare say, if you'll give me just a moment, that this month of October here at the National Press Club may bring some of the best speakers we've had in our history, and that's all due to her work. And I thank you very much for that, Melissa. We'll skip over our speaker for a moment. Chris Isham is Washington Bureau Chief with CBS News. Paula Kerger is President and CEO of PBS and guest of our speaker. Courtney McKay is a graduate student in Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. She's a graduate of their Documentary Institute, and she's a new NPC member. Welcome, Courtney. Betsy Fisher, a longtime executive producer with NBC's Meet the Press. Allison Fitzgerald is a reporter for Bloomberg News and a vice chair of our Speakers Committee. And Robert Yoon, able to get away today even though he's political research director for CNN. Robert, nice to have you here. And please give them a warm round of applause. Thank you. You know that signature style when you see it, the slow pan or zoom across an archive photo of a Confederate soldier, for example, the narration of a comfortably familiar voice like Tom Hanks or Morgan Freeman, perhaps with the sounds of harmonicas and banjos in back, all set against the backdrop of an historic American tale. It is literally called the Ken Burns effect, the iconic film technique made famous in such documentaries as The Civil War, baseball, jazz, and the national parks, among others. And our guest today is its creator. He is the filmmaker best known for leveraging American history into compelling television programming as no one else can. The Baltimore Sun wrote that he is not only the greatest documentarian of the day, but also the most influential filmmaker, period. And that includes the likes of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. Our guest today joins us in part to launch his latest series, which began airing last night on PBS, and I hope that many of you had an opportunity to see it in that first airing. Like all work highlighting pivotal eras in American history, like all of his work, this three-part series examines the rise and fall of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the series entitled Prohibition. Our guest today has called history, a table around which Americans can all have a civil conversation. So with the release of his Prohibition series, this veteran filmmaker is taking the opportunity to call for a new national discourse on civility and democracy. That is particularly relevant as Prohibition airs in the midst of this heated presidential campaign season, when the absence of civil discussion is itself causing distress. With a prolific record of film innovation and documentary work, his films have won 12 Emmy Awards and 2 Academy Award nominations. Among his numerous accolades, our guest is also the recipient of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Lifetime Achievement Award. This Brooklyn-born filmmaker catapulted into the film scene back in 1981 with a project that explored the world's first steel-wire suspension bridge. That film, Brooklyn Bridge. But it was his landmark series, broadcast in 1990, that was to become the highest-rated film series in American public television history. That's the Civil War, of course. And our guest won more than 40 major film and television awards, including 2 Emmy Awards and 2 Grammys. Prohibition is our guest's 22nd documentary for the public broadcasting system, marking a 30-year collaboration with PBS. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, the PBS partnership may rival that of our guest's relationship with the National Press Club, because he stood at this podium no fewer than 6 times to talk about his films. And for our members who might have missed Sunday night's first broadcast of Prohibition, the Press Club tonight will screen episode 1 during our special Speakeasy evening upstairs in our members' Reliable Source restaurant. Once again, please give a warm National Press Club welcome to Mr. Ken Burns.
My goodness, what a generous and kind introduction. I thought the press was supposed to be balanced and agnostic on this, but you've jumped right into a speakeasy night, I see. So maybe in that spirit, let's raise our glasses and toast to unintended consequences. I would be remiss if I did not thank the very, very important people that bring me, compel me, to this table and to this podium, and that includes our corporate underwriter, Bank of America, who has been with us for 5 years and has been among the most enlightened underwriters that we've ever had in more than 30 years of making films on public television. We also enjoy the support of the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Park Foundation, and a new group that we started called the Better Angels Society. A little bit more on that later. To attract new donors to public broadcasting, and in this case, the Montrone family through the Panatti's Corporation. We also have longtime support in this film from the National Endowment for the Humanities. They were instrumental in us being able to finish our film on the Brooklyn Bridge way back in the late 70s, and they were instrumental in making sure that we were able to finish this film. But 2 other sponsors deserve special note. Because without their longtime support, I literally would not be standing here. The first is the public broadcasting service itself, led by my friend Paula Kerger right now, who has made a long-term commitment to our films, so not only this, but others that we have in store, and others dating back more than 21 years. But the Corporation for Public Broadcasting takes the cake. They have been supporting us since the very, very first film, and I think have been involved in all but one of the films that we've worked on since we started making films. And I am so very grateful to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and to its current CEO, Pat Harrison, for their unwavering support. During the last 30 years, I have enjoyed as a production partner one of the most distinguished and important affiliates in the PBS system, and that is WETA, the local Washington, D.C. affiliate for public television. If you're not familiar with how public television works, it's really a kind of bottom-up model in which we depend on local stations to produce the programming which is sent upstream and then distributed by PBS. It is not a monolithic central network that decides what they're going to show and when they're going to show it. And for those last 30 years, I have enjoyed not only the partnership with, but the friendship of Sharon Rockefeller, and it's so great to once again share this table with her. And she like Pat and Paula, are dear friends as well. We couldn't leave home without them. We make a kind of cliche to filmmaking that it is a collaborative medium. It is, and it is important today, particularly, to acknowledge what I'll call the negative space of creation. And I do not mean that in any way pejoratively. A sculptor brings a block of stone to her studio and works on it, and what we get to see is the finished product. What she understands in her heart, in her gut, is all that is lying on the floor of the studio, the negative space of creation. That's true in almost any creative process. Certainly it's true in filmmaking, where quite often we might have 40 or 50 times as much material that we filmed or collected than can actually make it into the final film. This is called the shooting ratio. I happen to live in New Hampshire, and it takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. This is very much like documentary filmmaking. I realize, given the subject of our film today, I might have used Kentucky's model, which would be a process of distillation in which I believe the ratio is also about the same. Two people are not here, definitely not the negative space of our creation, but the very positive space of it. And that is my co-director and co-producer, Lynn Novick, who has been in every stage of this production, in every way, the equal in every decision that we've made in all aspects of the production. And I wish that she was here to be able to share in your attention this afternoon. I'd also like to acknowledge our co-producer, Sarah Botstein, who found many of the images and much of the very rare and in many cases never before seen footage that helped to populate this program on Prohibition. And so I think not dispensing with those, but acknowledging those very real supporters, let me try to begin and tell you, first of all, how honored I am to be back here at the National Press Club, and how honored and delighted I am to be talking about the special messages our past, our common heritage, continually directs our way. Let us listen. Let us listen. Too often as a culture we have ignored this joyful historical noise, becoming in the process blissfully ignorant of the power those past lives and stories and moments have over this moment, and indeed our vast unknown future. I am interested in that power of history, and I'm interested in its many varied voices, not the voices of the old top-down version of our past, which would try to convince us that American history is only the story of great men, capital G, capital M, and certainly not those voices that have recently entered our studies, voices which seem to suggest that American history is only a catalog of white European crimes. I am interested in listening to the voices of a true, honest, complicated past that is unafraid of controversy and tragedy, but equally drawn to those stories and moments that suggest an abiding faith in the human spirit, and particularly the unique role this remarkable, but sometimes also dysfunctional, more on that later, republic seems to play in the positive progress of mankind. That, quite simply, has been my creed, my mantra, the lens through which I have tried to share our histories for more than 30 years on public broadcasting. You know, I have to admit that in a way we have made the same film over and over again. Each film asks one deceptively simple question. Who are we? Who are we? Who are those strange and complicated people who like to call themselves Americans? What does an investigation of the past tell us about not only where we have been, but where we are and where we might be going? And while each film tries to answer the question, it can actually never answer it fully, of course. One hopes that with each successive project, you have the possibility of deepening the question. Who are we? Who are we? You know, American history is a loud, raucous, exquisite collection of noises that often in the aggregate combine to make the sweetest kind of music I know. And we have tried to listen as much as we can to this music in putting together the films we have made. It is a kind of emotional archaeology that we are attempting, listening to the ghosts and echoes of an almost inexpressibly wise past that paradoxically points us confidently towards those future horizons that will comprise our destiny as individuals, as well as communities and a country. And that is what I am interested in. And this new project on Prohibition is no different. You know, I appeared here 21 years ago for the very first time for the Civil War. And I stood at this podium and I told you that if I told you I had been working on a film project about the imperial presidency, about new weapons of mass destruction at a level unseen before, about unscrupulous military contractors who sold shoddy goods to the government at exorbitant prices, about a growing feminist movement, you would tell me, my goodness, Ken, you've abandoned history and you are working on the present moment. But of course, those were only a handful of the themes that compelled the story of our history of the Civil War. I come back to you again, redundantly, to begin to tell you that though we have in our minds sort of safe and familiar images of prohibition that now have unfortunately been distilled down into our children's textbooks to a paragraph or two, and they seem to be Model Ts careening around rain-slick Chicago streets with machine guns blasting, the story of the popular and familiar gangsters, or the bobbed hair, short skirt, braless flapper dancing on the tables of a speakeasy in this new expression of the literally roaring 20s. We will have ignored at our peril the central themes that for us brought us to the project and seem to reverberate today. If you know your Bible, in Ecclesiastes 1:9, it says, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." And ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something about prohibition and see if it sounds familiar. This is the story of single-issue political campaigns, wedge-issue campaigns that metastasize with horrible unintended consequences. This is the story of the demonization of recent immigrant groups to the United States, and as always, the demonization of African Americans. This is the story of unfunded congressional mandates, of the loss of civil discourse, of smear campaigns during our presidential election cycles, about a whole group of people who feel sincerely that they have lost control of their country and want desperately to get it back and will do anything they can to take it back. This is the story of the role of government. What is its precise and correct relationship to its citizens? This is the story of warrantless wiretaps. This is the story of a growing and developing feminist movement. Does it all sound familiar? These are only a handful of the themes that animated our interest in the Prohibition story. And so we have made a three-part, nearly 6-hour series, which began broadcasting last night. The first episode is called A Nation of Drunkards. It details the century of activity in the United States that led up to the passage of the 18th Amendment. The temperance movement, the very understandable temperance movement in a country awash in alcohol, where we were drinking 5, 6, 7 times the amount of alcohol that we now consume. And the problem of drunkenness, as they called it then, not alcoholism, was a huge social problem being addressed first by the clergy and later by a new group of people who were feeling their first agency in this new republic, women, who of course, did not have the right to vote, and had absolutely no rights at the beginning of the 19th century, but who, through their support of abolition and temperance, began to find that voice, began to achieve that agency, began to act outside the house in powerful and interesting ways. That movement ebbed and flowed. It was, of course, hijacked by those who thought not just temperance, but total abstinence, capital teetotal abstinence, would be the best thing. And of course, a new, modern, single-issue movement was born that blotted out the efforts of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and other periodic crusades that were sponsored by women across the country, and taken over by the single most effective and powerful lobbying organization in the history of the United States, something a group that I had never heard of going into this project called the Anti-Saloon League. Its leader, Wayne B. Wheeler, was as powerful as any human being has ever been outside of holding public office in the United States, and I had never heard of him either. It was said of Wayne B. Wheeler that he could make the Senate of the United States sit up and beg, and he did, and they did. It is an interesting and fascinating story as the Women's Christian Temperance Union was sort of shoved aside, and the Anti-Saloon League with its single-issue campaign. They wanted only one goal, the elimination of alcohol, and worked tirelessly to do it. And they were willing to compromise on nothing, and yet willing to make alliances with anybody if it would advance their goal. When Myron T. Herrick, who was the very popular but moderate Republican governor of Ohio, said he thought that local towns should have a voice in what they were doing. The Anti-Saloon League got him unelected, and the Democratic challenger, who was thought to have no chance in the race, elected in his place. It is a fascinating story which seems ultimately modern in every respect. They were turning out tons and tons and tons of anti-liquor propaganda every month from their plant in Westerville, Ohio, which was their headquarters, a town just north of Columbus. It is a fascinating story. But what is more fascinating is how a majority of Americans came to embrace the notion that we needed an amendment to the Constitution that actually limited human freedom when every other amendment to the Constitution has actually expanded human freedom. That has been the American model. We have moved forward into our uncertain future by extending to our citizens more rights than they had before. This is the only amendment that actually curtailed those rights. And by the turn of the 20th century, and in the first 2 decades of that tumultuous century, we found a huge, strange collection of people who were for Prohibition in some way, shape, or form. Progressives were for it, as well as the very conservative Anti-Saloon League. Democrats, as well as Republicans. Prohibition came to be seen as a way to solve all of society's ills, that we could just swallow this pill, this magic bullet, this panacea which would change everything, that every family would be improved, that the slums would empty, men would walk upright, the evangelist Billy Sunday said, women would smile, children would laugh, and hell would forever be for rent if this amendment went through. Industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller were for it because they thought that alcohol weakened the output of their working men. The Wobblies, the radical labor union of the IWW, the International Workers of the World, were for it too. They saw Prohibition, they saw alcohol as a capitalist plot to destroy the working man and joined this odd bandwagon towards Prohibition. We had the NAACP was for it. Booker T. Washington arguing always and passionately for a black advancement and the development of a black middle class, saw the obstacle of alcoholism as central or as a huge enough problem that they needed to join that bandwagon. But then the Ku Klux Klan was for it too. They were anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-black, and the last thing they feared was a black man with a bottle in one hand and a ballot in the other. Everything coalesced around it, and then finally, as we moved into the second decade of the 20th century, 2 things sort of made it a reality. The first was the 16th Amendment. Now, the Anti-Saloon League shrewdly allied themselves, many would say cynically allied themselves, with progressive groups interested in the redistribution of wealth in the United States, because there was in that time, as we argue and debate today, a huge disparity between the haves and the have-not. The Gilded Age and the robber barons had squeezed the middle class, the poor were rising in their ranks, the rich were getting richer, and progressive movement wanted, among a number of agendas, to redistribute the wealth in the United States. They thought the best way to do this was to pass an amendment to the Constitution that would initiate an income tax. Strangely, the Anti-Saloon League joined with them because they knew that by supporting this amendment, they would ensure that the liquor industry, the brewers and distillers, would no longer have the symbiotic relationship they had with Uncle Sam. Because up to that point, fully 70% of all internal revenues for the federal government came from taxing beer and spirits. And despite local prohibition movements, the beer and the liquor industries were confident that they would never be disconnected from the person most addicted to them, which was the federal government. The income tax proved them wrong, and they found themselves in deep trouble. The second event, not of the Anti-Saloons League's doing, as far as I can tell, is the First World War. And that, of course, made in this country all Germans, the third or second largest immigrant group, depending on how you're counting, the enemy. That you could, in essence, equate beer with treason. And they did. The government propaganda office and the Anti-Saloon League, working almost hand in hand, were able to convince people of the threat that came from the evil Hun, not just from without, but within the United States. And we stoned Dachshunds to death. A German-American citizen was killed for no other crime than speaking German over a backyard fence to a neighbor. And we renamed sauerkraut Liberty Cabbage. Sound familiar? It only took a few more votes, and we had passed by huge, overwhelming majorities in the House and the Senate, a prohibition amendment. The Dries wanted a prohibition amendment because we had come to see since the Civil War that the Constitution was much more than a handbook, a manual for making this country run. It was a place in which we could fulfill our utopian dreams. This notion of a city on the hill, a more perfect union, as the preamble suggests, was an unbelievable windmill to tilt at. And we had begun to initiate amendments which we thought would do good. And the Prohibition Amendment fit into that. And so it passed overwhelmingly by the House and the Senate and moved on to the states to ratify it, which they did in record time. The Wets had shrewdly, they thought, given the Dries 7 years to do it, and they did it in 13 months, the ratification. The Wets had been confident that no amendment could work its way through all of those states, pass with the kind of majorities required in all of those states, and became law. But it did in 1919, and it would go into effect exactly a year later in January of 1920. I've just given you a short précis of what you missed last night. Tonight is an episode called A Nation of Scofflaws. And tomorrow night, the third episode, which details the second half of the nearly 14-year rule of Prohibition, is called A Nation of Hypocrites. May I first say that these are titles we did not impose on the material from the comfort of our present position as amateur historians and documentary filmmakers, but what came out of anxieties and descriptions of that period: a nation of drunkards, a nation of scofflaws, a nation of hypocrites. What resonated out of every moment of working on this film was a sense of how little we knew about this period. I'm a filmmaker who spent a lot of time in the 1920s in our baseball series, in jazz, and other films we've worked on, and other films we are planning to work on, and I had never known the dimensions of this. I spent a lot of time in the 19th century, and of course knew that temperance ran alongside emancipation, knew in a film we made about women's rights the way in which suffrage, a much more radical idea, was sort of made mainstream by its attachment to temperance, the idea that if you gave women the vote, they would help to vote against alcohol. All of these things I thought I knew, but both Lynn and I were staggered daily by the sense that we did not know anything, that, as Harry Truman once said, the only thing that's really new is the history you don't know. This was an extraordinary and fascinating journey into another territory, which I hope you have an opportunity to see, because it is a different kind of take. By the way, we've got those gangsters, and we've got those flappers, and we think the film is sexy and exciting and wonderful and dangerous and all of those things, but it is a deeper dive because you realize after a while that the focus on Al Capone makes us forget that ordinary citizens, probably most of us in this room, had we been alive then, would have broken the law, and that ordinary citizens did. Journalists and filmmakers, doctors and lawyers and lobbyists, and the guy on the corner and the guy around the corner. All were breaking the law. You know, one of the things that Dan Okrent, our chief creative consultant, told us while we were making the film is that while the Volstead Act, the law that was used to apply the amendment, was draconian in one sense, it defined alcohol as 1/2 of 1% content, which, as he pointed out, made German chocolate cake and that sauerkraut, Liberty cabbage, illegal. But that it also had unusual loopholes for medicinal purposes. Lots of doctors wrote prescriptions that only alcohol apparently could cure. And that we also had a loophole for sacramental uses. And so congregations and temples would grow by tenfold. And that while there is often a very precise set of guidelines of how you become a priest in the Catholic faith, there is not so certain a route in the Jewish faith, and who is to say who is not and who is not a rabbi, who is and who is not a rabbi. And in that case, there were lots of rabbis named O'Shanahan and Kelly. This is American ingenuity at its best, and the unintended consequences are so impressive and so exciting that we, have to think about them and consider them as we wonder about drugs, as we look at the horrible record of organized crime, not just in that brief period, but that is still with us. We would not have organized crime without Prohibition. And of course, female alcoholism jumped severely. But what we're reminded of, too, and what has compelled a good deal of our conversation about this film around the country, as we've taken around the country, is this sense of the loss of a civil discourse in our country. I asked Shelby Foote why the Civil War happened when we were making that documentary series. And he said, it happened because we failed to do what we have a genius for. You know, Americans like to think of themselves as uncompromising people, but our genius was for compromise, and when that failed, we nearly destroyed each other. It is the loss, the periodic loss of our ability to compromise, our willingness not to see that the moral absolutists have it right, that it is all black and white, right and wrong, but a strange and wonderful combination of all sorts of people struggling for one part of the truth. George Will, in another film, said that democracy is the politics of the half loaf. You never get it all. And yet in Prohibition, we saw an example where we had a group of self-righteous people absolutely convinced they knew what was right and what was wrong, unwilling to compromise, thereby dooming their noble, so-called noble experiment to failure. And I think the lessons of Prohibition, whether it's in single-issue politics, in this loss of civil discourse, in all of the ways that I described, the demonization of recent immigrants, because many of the people doing the demonization today were themselves once the victims of that very discrimination. Prohibition stands as one of the most effective teachers I have ever come across. And I so enjoyed the opportunity to be able to work in it, to dive into a sense of American psyche that it is both generous and greedy, sincere and hypocritical, prurient and Puritan, Saturday night and Sunday morning, all at the same time, and not just between groups, which is the easy way in which we distinguish between ourselves today, and we do too much, we are too dialectically preoccupied pointing out red state or blue state, north or south, east or west, black or white, male or female, young or old, gay or straight, hip or square, whatever thing we need to superimpose something label on someone else. We forget how much we share in common, and that I think the opportunity that PBS provides me to do a film like Prohibition, the themes that it engages, we are reminded of how present the past is and what a great teacher it is as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks again for coming back to the Press Club. And I know that our many members and members of the audience here are anxious to hear you speak as you just did, and then also to pose some questions, and so we have those now. Let's just take it from really where you left off there. When documentarians many years from now try to frame history in the current moment, what do you think they will say led us up to this particularly argumentative time in our history?
Well, I think that we understand that that a wedge issue, which in retrospect looks to us to be abhorrent, is actually expedient and politically effective. And quite often, the shortest distance between what you think you want and getting what you think you want are those sorts of tactics. And I think that as our politics have become, in large matter due to our complicity, and I mean our within the establishment of the media world that we live in, have fed this beast, it becomes easier and easier for us to become independent free agents and not participants in a democracy willing to compromise. And as long as that happens, then we'll see the kind of gridlock, we'll see the kind of lack of compromise, we'll see, therefore, the lack of progress that every citizen wants, regardless of whatever point on the political spectrum they come from.
You said when we had a chance to speak beforehand today that in many ways, though, this does seem very parallel to other parts in our history. And I think since we're inhabiting this time, we have a tendency to want to make it the most something.
Right.
So can you put it in that kind of context in your view? How does it rank compared to other portions of our history? Is it as dramatic as it may seem to those of us who are living it?
We are always, because we're living in it, in the most dramatic times ever. This is our bias. The great arrogance of the present is somehow, because we are alive and it's happening to us, this is the most important time, and those people in the past could not have lived as full of lives as we do. And that's one of the things that history has, that ability to lift that veil and make the distant past, and I don't mean just our distant past, our pre-revolutionary colonial history, but I mean 10,000 years ago. We can lift the veil on that and extend to those human beings their humanness, who lived and loved, hated and worried in the same capacity that we do. This is not as tough economic times. We've done many films on the Depression, which was the ultimate ender of Prohibition, and in that time, in that very desperate time, in some cities the animals in the zoo were shot and the meat distributed to the poor. When that happens here, please let me know, and we can now begin to change our description from recession to depression. The election of 1928, in which Al Smith, both a wet and a Catholic, was so effectively eviscerated by the drive forces and by other intolerant forces in America, stands as one of the worst election campaigns I've ever seen. But it looks very similar to the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And we've had a lot worse, and we've had a lot better between that. And so I don't like the fact that historians often like to say that, that things are in cycles, or that whatever we don't remember, we're condemned to forget. That seems an obvious corollary to the very central theme that I hope I've made too, is that human nature never changes. We are the same kind of people we were 10,000 years ago. The greediness and the generosity, the hypocrisy and the sincerity exist in equal measures, not only between but within us. And that has to become our struggle too. That question, who are we, is actually a convenient mask to the real question that all of us face, regardless of what we're in, which is, who am I? What am I doing here? What am my purpose? What will I leave?
Here's another political question. Having studied the Prohibition era, do you think any of the modern efforts to implement constitutional bans, such as a ban on gay marriage or abortion, can or might be successful?
I think one of the lasting positive legacies of Prohibition has been our now natural suspicion of the next new good thing, the next new magic bullet which will cure everything, the next panacea. And so I think we have become rightfully suspicious of of those amendments, if you just pass the blankety-blank thing, everything will be all right. Those single-issue groups who feel that they can see the whole of American history and the whole of the American political system, all of our problems through the tiny, narrow lens of this single issue, and by doing it, as the Prohibitionists thought, everything will be all right, that, as Billy Sunday said, hell will forever be for rent. Well, let me tell you that with standing room only line to get into hell, because of the loopholes and the enticements that Prohibition, the unintended consequences that it sponsored. And I think that's been a healthy, utterly American thing. We've gone back to amendments that are merely mechanical. They're about how you keep the machine going, how often you add oil to it, how often you do this, what the presidential succession is, when you're going to inaugurate a president. We're no longer tinkering in the same way, I think in large part because we have this deep suspicion of people who will try to sell us that solution, and that comes from Prohibition.
Someone's asking, and I think you addressed this, but perhaps this is a little more succinct in the way it's questioned. Do you think the 18th Amendment was the product primarily of a conservative or liberal political ideology?
Let us remember, alcoholism was a huge social problem in the early 19th century. It was a huge social problem in 1920 when we passed Prohibition, or Prohibition went into effect. It is a huge social problem today. And we as a community, as a government, whatever you'd like to say, have obligations to address this problem. And so the reason why Prohibition initially was passed is because that broad array of people, no matter what their ulterior motives might have been, sincerely thought that we could take this big problem off the table. Now, this big problem is suffered by perhaps 10% of our population. We made the unfortunate decision to apply the solution to 100% of the people. It did not work, but it does not leave us free of the moral obligation to try to improve society. That is the role of government, that is the role of organizations, that is the role of individuals, that is the role of churches, that is our role. And so this is not an issue that's left or right. This is a human issue.
Okay, here's a personal question from a member of our audience. It says, now that you've been dealing with this subject matter for so long, you've been asked on the road whether you were a teetotaler or something more, let's say, energetic in the consumption of alcohol than that. Has your own research and production of the film had any effect on your thoughts about that subject?
That is so funny. I've spent a good deal of my professional life as a teetotaler because I've had to wear so many hats that we tend to work long days, and I always found that stopping for the drink when everybody else was not conducive to continuing that work for much longer. But I decided in the course of Prohibition, just as I did when I was making a film on the celibate religious sect, the Shakers, and conceived with my co-producer on that film, my first of 4 daughters, that it was important for me to balance out the teetotaling aspects of so many of the individuals in our film that I felt compelled to drink, and drink significantly during the course of this.
All in the name of creativity.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's just a professional responsibility.
Well, that leads us to the next question, which actually now makes me a little frightened because we had a presidential candidate vying for the Republican nomination here not that long ago who's an advocate of legalization of marijuana. So what parallels do you see with the violence in Mexico and along the border with the Prohibition era?
It's so interesting, and that's a wonderful question. And as Lynn and I approached it, we assumed that that would be what we would be dealing with, that the parallels would extend that far. They were overwhelmed and essentially pushed aside by all the other parallels that I spoke to you that seem more to our essential character. But these comparisons still remain, and they're not insignificant, and we ought to talk about them a lot. And we ought to use the occasion of history, that table that you cited, Mark, around which we can still have that civil discourse, to maybe engage questions of marijuana. It is our largest cash crop, more than soybeans, more than corn, more than wheat. We look in difficult economic times at a source of potential revenue if it's taxed and regulated. we hope that there could be a concurrent diminution of the violence attending to its distribution. But I would say that we have to step back a second and realize that alcohol has been consumed by human beings as long as there have been human beings. And there is broad, not just popular usage, but acceptance of it in all manners of society. Drug use is more, and marijuana, to be specific, is more a subcultural manifestation that comes and goes in various places at various times. That is quite different, and so applying the same sorts of things that we learned in Prohibition to this may not be adequate, and I would urge those, whoever they are, who are considering this, to proceed slowly and to remember about unintended consequences. However, the single most difficult aspect of this, the violence that attended to it, is also connected to cocaine and heroin trade, and inextricably connected. By pulling marijuana out, you don't suddenly lose violent drug lords in Mexico or Colombia. In fact, who knows what the unintended consequence might be of denying them the marijuana business. And then I think if you ask cocaine and heroin to join the same conversation as marijuana, a huge, vast, overwhelming majority of Americans cannot go there. And then you're now back, not so much at square one, but at a very cautious, experimental phase in which you try to figure out the ways in which the decriminalization of marijuana could take place.
So to the extent that your work ultimately, it seems, always involves the question, who are we? How honest are we with ourselves about the role of alcohol in our society, both for the good and the bad at the present?
I think we are rarely honest about anything in our society, whether it's sexuality or faith, whether it's greed, or any of the things that have been, tangentially the topic, the energies, if you will, of the subjects of our films. As someone not interested in making or scoring political points in the film, but in sharing the conundrum of American human existence and hoping that the distance from us to that moment provides us with some measure of perspective that we might be able to apply it however each individual viewer wishes to apply it to the current situation, renders your question just that, an excellent question.
Thank you. I'll take that in lieu of another answer. I'm told in 1998 you gave a speech titled "Why I'm a Yellow Dog Democrat," and you donated to Democratic candidates and endorsed President Obama, Barack Obama, for president, and you produced a video for Senator Kennedy's 2008 speech to the convention. In light of all of that, the person wants to know, how do you separate, let's say, your personal opinion and from your work as a documentarian, or the question would be, how much do you want to separate that?
I want so passionately to separate it. My own personal beliefs, whatever they might be, and all of that question did was narrowly pick up some things. They don't describe friendships across the political spectrum or conservative aspects to myself that need also, I suppose, to be included in a fairer question. But I'm interested in the facts. The facts that the Battle of Gettysburg took place on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863 is not a Democratic or a Republican question. It's a fact. The fact that the Women's Christian Temperance Union might be a progressive organization and the Anti-Saloon League might be perceived as a more conservative one in today's standards or in how we would describe it for today's people is neither here nor there in terms of my own political calibration. So what I do in my spare time is my own business, and I will continue to have my own business. But all of my work for public television has been free of that kind of bias, advocacy. In the end, that kind of film only preaches to the congregation. And it has been my mission since the very beginning, and it has been the fact of the response to these films that they have reached out across the very superficial definition of party lines to the much more important sense of the broadness and the majesty of our country, and spoken to people from every walk of life. If they were merely the reflection of the sort of isolated aspects of that question, the films would not have the power that I think that they've had.
But the question I think a journalist has asked themselves, as well as a historian, and obviously there are a lot of things that are in common in those pursuits, is obviously there are some things upon which all of us agree, and there are some things that perhaps none of us truly agree, and there are some things that are in the middle. So when you're looking to present essentially the story,
yeah,
how do you decide
very
that's
good.
okay
yeah, very.
And that is not?
That's a very, very good question. And what we do is what any good mutual fund manager would do. We average. We are dependent as a result of the grants we receive not only from the National Endowment for the Humanities but other groups to have with us a variety of historical advisors. And they represent a whole spectrum, both politically but also academically, on any particular subject. And our films, these are not window dressing. They are people that we consult at every juncture, major juncture in the production, and they come in and they help to center it and remind you of other things. There was, we had interesting discussions with Prohibition in which we were reminded again and again and again, and I think had to be reminded that this was as much a progressive movement as it was a conservative movement, that though it did get hijacked, it became the agenda of a kind of nativist, anti-immigrant thing, the notion that we say in the very beginning of our film from Mark Twain that nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. That is to say that this is prohibition for someone else, and everyone woke up with the worst hangover without having a drink, which, as it turns out, it was for them as well as someone else, that we permitted the extraordinary advice and influence of those scholars to make sure that Gettysburg still remains on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of July, 1863.
So your career has been, as best I can tell, entirely devoted to producing material for public broadcasting.
Yes.
And in this politicized environment in which we live, there are real budgetary pressures that the Congress and the President are working to manage. How fearful are you that some aspects of public broadcasting do fall to the budget acts? The other part of that question would be, if it were truly an environment where everybody had to give something up, would it not be fair for public broadcasting to give something up as well?
These are all important questions, and I wish I had my friend William F. Buckley, who appeared on public television for 30 years and only on public television for 30 years, to help me answer your excellent question. We have given up. And we continue to give up again and again and again. And that means the National Endowment for the Humanities, whose contributions to the Civil War film approach 45%, and now we often receive, when we're lucky and we do the due diligence of producing the doorstopper proposals that they still, and quite rightfully require, receive sometimes less than 10%. And still receive the largest grant they're giving. We have given up and given up and given up. I think, like Prohibition, we sometimes fall prey to preconceived notions that permit the discussion to fall into the realm of the cultural wars, if you will. It is so interesting that we are an organization that helps to stitch the country together, that we represent a fraction of 1% of the budget, that we are as central to the lives of red staters, as in perhaps even more so than we are to blue staters, which betrays the sense that there's some bias. People always say that, and I ask, will you show me the incidence of bias that you are perceived? And no one can ever actually point it out. I remember during the 90s, the friends I knew in the Clinton administration railed against public radio and public broadcasting for their conservative bias. I think it's often power feels uncomfortable in the face of good journalism. I don't need to be preaching that in this cathedral. We would hope that people could understand that while we have nothing to do with the defense of our country, we help make this country worth defending. That not everything has to be in the marketplace, that indeed when your house is on fire at 3 a.m., you do not call the marketplace. And we would like to suggest that this underfunded and quite often much maligned network, PBS and National Public Radio, nevertheless, in terms of my familiarity with PBS, produces the best children's, the best science, the best nature, the best arts, the best public affairs, and I'm told the best history on the dial. And when you've got 500 or 600 other channels as competition, that's a pretty good record.
We're almost out of time. I won't be fired if we go over, but I do want to ask a question, because you mentioned some do regard this institution as a cathedral to the First Amendment. At a time when newspapers are struggling so mightily, and indeed traditional broadcast outlets have also suffered during the downturn. Part of that's the digital transition, part of it's the economy. Let's just focus for a moment on newspapers. As one who's looked at newspapers as a source for material over the years, how important is it in your view, either in printed or digital form, that they continue to survive?
It is essential to the survival of our republic, not to their survival. It's important for our survival that they survive. And I can tell you that when we began to do publicity tours and you'd go through a big U.S. city and the newsroom, and it was filled, it was the size of a football stadium and filled with hundreds of football field, filled with hundreds and hundreds of reporters, and then you go by 10 years later and the tumbleweeds we're going through. This is terrifying. We now rely on an internet in which there's, with some notable and really excellent exceptions, a lot of rumor and innuendo. Nobody is watching the city councilman to find out if he's bought the property adjacent to the thing they're about to buy. That's the role of newspapers. We've got one newspaper in this country that's got a reporter in southern Sudan. That's really important. What happens in southern Sudan is really important to us in this room today, whether we know it or not. We need to have that top-to-bottom possibility, and the great terror of the transformation that's going on, that it is both the changes in our economic system in which we are extracting more than we are putting in. We are manufacturing less and servicing more. All of them suggest dangerous threats on this important institution, which, as we know, our founders saw as central to the survival of our republic. And so I think that anything that strengthens these institutions, whether now online, and let us not be Luddites afraid to embrace new forms of distribution and technologies, but let us also be clear that the rumor and opinion is not the same as the dogged research, that the person who merely offers to push the idea or the lie down the road is not important as the person who's willing to do the difficult work to find out what the truth might be. And that is one of the reasons why, with many other enticements before me, I have remained loyal to public television, because I believe that this is the place in which I can exercise whatever talents I have in this area of American history and do it to the best of my ability. And I have been offered, marketplace included, no other venue that would permit me to do as deep a dive in the subjects that I'm interested in without interference from sponsors or interruptions of commercials than any other place in the country, period, full stop.
Very good. Well, I know there are many journalism people who feel passionately about journalism, as you do in our audience today, and we're thankful for those comments. We're almost out of time. Before we ask literally the last question, a couple of routine housekeeping matters to take care of. First of all, reminding you about some upcoming luncheon speakers. On the 5th of October this week, Congressman Ron Paul, candidate for the GOP presidential nomination, will be here. Later in the month, speaking of internet delivery of news, TMZ's Harvey Levin will talk about the changing landscape in entertainment news coverage. That's October 24th. And something that you're familiar with, I believe, Ken, and that is the tried and true tradition of presenting you with a token of our appreciation, and that is the National Press Club coffee mug before we ask that last question. Thank you for being here again today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So one final question.
I've now got half a dozen.
Indeed. And we don't want to see those on eBay. One final question.
Wait.
Yes.
Before you do that, my work has always been bottom-up history. We don't feel that a top-down version is enough. And I think it's important to acknowledge that today is actually, Mark, your birthday. And in that spirit of historical investigation, I'd like everybody to sing Happy Birthday to Mark. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Mark. Happy birthday to you. Make a good wish.
Thank you. Well, that certainly takes the cake. I'll tell you what, we'll go ahead and thank you very much for that. I couldn't have asked for a better surprise on this day, and obviously I wouldn't have rather been anywhere else but to have been here with you today, in all truthfulness, so I appreciate that very much. My last question is, you, as you said earlier, you live in the space of public broadcasting and weighty material. Can you share with us perhaps a guilty pleasure that you share in the commercial broadcast realm or film environments that perhaps we wouldn't have known that Ken Burns was a fan of this?
Yeah. Well, my biggest commercial television vice, and it is a vice because I actually travel around the country and found myself stuck at odd hours in hotel rooms and therefore don't have the benefits of TiVo to get around the commercials, the many, many commercials that we still do not have in public broadcasting. And I am addicted, as my oldest daughter is, to Law and Order. And I don't mean the other spin-offs. I mean the pure, straight, not neat, as we'd say in the bartending business, Law and Order. And even if I've seen them, it is sort of like the equivalent of the Japanese no drama. It is such a perfect elastic form that you can see things over and over again and still marvel at how they connect the dots. And I remember doing that the other day when I had something much more important I should have been working on. I was addicted to that.
Thank you. Thank you. How about a round of applause for our speaker today? Thank you very much, Ken. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for making this day even more special than I would have expected. I'd also like to thank our National Press Club staff, including our library and broadcast center, for organizing today's event, and you can find out more about the club at www.press.org. Thank you, and we're adjourned.
That's great. Oh, good. Oh, well, stay with it. It gets a little more exciting. You get those gangsters and you get those flappers. And we found home movies.